All right, hello, how are you today? This is part two. This is actually take two for me because, of course, technology hates me and does not want me to embrace the 21st century. But here we are anyway. I will arise victorious in this flipping the classroom experiment. So let's plug on while I'm here doing this. We are talking about immigration and urbanization continued. This is part two. Hopefully you have been following along in your notes. You have filled out the note packet as we go. So if you are following along, we were just talking about part one. However long ago you watched that was about this idea of immigration and people coming here from the different cities to we talked about the push factors, things that were pushing them out, as well as the pull factors, things that were pulling them in. But the gist of it is, people are here in record number trying to start a new life. So today what we're going to look at what that life was like for them, what was going on in the cities where they settled once they got through Ellis Island, through Angel Island, those types of things, what life was like. Hopefully you followed along in the last video. You found a lot of that information. Hopefully it was helpful to you as you're doing your project, as you are looking at some of those factors of their old life, of why they came over here, those kinds of things. But now we're going to be looking at more of that sort of the fifth point of the project in terms of what life is like for them now that they're here. So let's go ahead and flip through the slides as we do that. Again, I just like last video, I'm recording through the Move Note, which matches up to screens on the computer, but I'm also using a regular video camera. So if you're watching that video right there, you'll just have to follow along with your own notes, as opposed to you guys have the notes right here with you. So if you follow along on your slides, we're talking about immigrant life. We're talking about the people, the immigrants, once they got here. I talked about last time, if you kind of remember where the immigrants came from, once they got to America, we know that a lot of them settled in those urban areas. So we're going to look at those numbers now. Approximately 1/3 ended up staying in New York City. Another big chunk ended up going to other urban areas, Detroit, Boston, Chicago, St. Louis. A lot of our immigrant population blossomed during this time as well. A lot of people were going to those urban areas. We'll talk a little bit about that a few slides from now, but basically that's where the work was, where they could find the work. And so most of them ended up staying. We know that 2/3 of the population that did stay ended up in these urban areas. They ended up staying with friends, relatives. Again, we talked about that last time, how they would sort of segregate and go to sort of like-minded groups of people because that would help them adjust better. They spoke the language, they had the same religion, they had the same holidays and customs, and so those that sort of flocked together and stayed together in their like people groups had an easier time adjusting. And so we're going to see that. But another 1/3, we really don't talk about them as much, ended up going back home after immigrating here. They might have just immigrated for a time. They're kind of, birds of passage, that they just kind of came for a season and then they, migrated back. Just like birds fly to the south for winter just to escape the winter cold. They fly to the south, and then, when the conditions have improved, they go back north. Well, that's a lot of what was happening with these immigrants. We look back at their economic situation or persecution that they were experiencing, those tyrannies, those dictatorships. If things had improved back home, and especially those young men who kind of came by themselves, then they ended up going back to their native countries after a period of time of maybe building up some money at work and then going back and those kinds of things. So we started seeing actually a good 1/3 of them, even though a big chunk came, several of them ended up going back home. But let's talk about the ones that stayed, what life was like for them. we know that 2/3 settled in these urban areas. And we're going to see the urban population, the population of cities at this time is just going to explode. We're talking New York City, for instance, where we know 1/3 of them stayed. 800,000 people in 1860 lived in New York City. That's, pre-Civil War. 800,000 people. Post all of this industrialization that we talked about, by the 1900, 3.5 million. So 800,000, 3.5 million. That is a big, significant jump in numbers. Okay, we're talking 4.5 times as many people live there 40 years later. From 1860 to 1900. Chicago actually experienced an even bigger boom, going from 100,000 people in 1860, 100,000 to 1.6 million. Okay, that's more than 10 times a growth in 40 years. Okay, so cities are really gonna be scrambling to try to figure out what to do with this population of people that now are living in these cities that had never, lived there before. We're going to talk on the next slide, partially, yes, these immigrants came in, but actually a good chunk of people actually came from rural areas as well. So we'll talk about that in a second, but 30 million people living in 1,700 cities by the time 1900 hits. That is a huge population boom for cities. This is when urbanization, that's what I'm talking about, is this process of people now flocking to cities and building up those cities to sort of figure out what to do. That's urbanization. That's what we're going to be talking about for the next few slides. Okay. One of the things that made it possible, new technology, how they were able to use steel. We're going to see how steel actually makes skyscrapers where buildings can grow up instead of out, because there was no out. Places like New York City, it's an island. Manhattan's an island. You can't really do a whole lot of growing out. So not a lot of land, very limited land, but definitely a high demand for that land. So we're going to see things like the steel skyscrapers. We're going to see even electric elevator making those things possible. If you look at your notes, it talks about mass transit systems and how now, because of the electricity, we can have electric trolley cars. And we're going to see things like subways, because the cities are so crowded that even just putting everybody in a car, there's not enough room on the streets for all the cars. So we're going to see them build under, sub, right? Sub means under. So this is a subway, a way to commute under the ground, and trains that are actually going to be elevated up above ground. And we're going to start seeing those things happen because of the urbanization of the 1900s, right around 1900. And we're going to see these cities just booming because of this. Of course, we know the cities were very ill adapted to manage this kind of growth. And so especially the poor is going to be hit very hard by this. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about when we talk about the tenement living. But if you look at the first slide here under tenement living, it actually talks about how, again, those rural people were coming in from the countryside. We talked about that. Even last unit, we talked about rural, or last part of the unit when we were talking about industrialization, we talked about rural people coming in and finding work in factories. So those people who, tried to make it a living out west, couldn't really make it work, and so they're flocking partially because this whole idea of the big city life. We know electricity's new. We know, even things like plumbing. That's a new technology that people in the city have modern plumbing. People out in rural areas, they're using like latrines and outhouses and not really the greatest of situations. So they're thinking, hey, big city life, that sounds fun. Let's move to the city. So you have these immigrants who are coming, and we'll talk about, why, a big reason why they are staying in the cities, besides the fact that they lived with each other, but also these rural people coming in as well. So when you have a large population of poor people, of course the cities are naturally going to segregate wealthy over here, poor over here, and the poor are going to be living in what's called tenements. And these tenements are kind of, if you can think of them like apartments, that'll help you sort of visualize it. And these apartments were very rundown, low rent, housing situations, massive overcrowding. 3/4, if we're talking about like New York City, 3/4 of New York City residents lived in these tenements, these dark, overcrowded, multi-family sort of apartment buildings. And as we kind of keep going on the slides here, you can see an example of one of those. But what you would see here in this tenement is again the multi-families. You see 4 bedrooms here on this picture of a tenement, sort of this common living space over here with sort of a public hall connecting all of it together. So multiple families living in one space, and these tenements would have about 4 of these sort of sections on one floor, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. But not only were multiple families sharing these, but you would see that one family sort of, in order to make rent cheaper, would actually rent out to boarders. They would have people come and live with them and share a fraction of that rent and say, yeah, you can come live in our tenement with us in our small overcrowded tenement, but you're gonna have to pay a portion of the rent. And yeah, it was super crowded, but you saved some money doing it that way. So a lot of the poor people in the cities, the urban poor, had to live in these kinds of situations. Again, I mentioned that they would have these 4-room apartments. There'd be 4 of them per floor. They have very few windows, so of course you're going to get little light and of course little ventilation. And when you don't have ventilation, you don't have windows to sort of let things out, things like fires are a very common sort of phenomenon, if you will, very common occurrence in these tenement apartments. So fire is very common. We know diseases, in a crowded area, one person coughs and it very quickly spreads because they're living right on top of each other. There's no room really for those germs to go except on other people. And so disease was very common. Fires were common. And of course, just naturally, when you have those things, you're going to have death. Death was a common occurrence for the urban poor. We talk about a dangerous life. We talk about 40% of immigrants suffering from tuberculosis or lung disease. 40% from those diseases. 60% of infants that they died before their first birthday because the living conditions were just so poor that they couldn't. They didn't have the resources, they didn't have the health that they needed. Again, babies are very susceptible to those kinds of situations. Any kind of sickness, if they get it, it's really hard for them to recover. And if they're not adequately fed and not getting adequate sleep in these tenements, they're not kept warm, then they're susceptible to these kinds of things a lot more significantly. So the infant mortality rate at this time for the urban poor was extremely high. 60% is just, that's atrociously high. And that's what life was like for these people in these tenements. We know this because of Jacob Riis. He wrote about the slum life. He actually wrote, he's a Danish immigrant who came and documented what life was like in these slums and these tenements, what the poor was like in his book, How the Other Half Lives. So as he came over here as an immigrant, he's documenting this for us to be able to look back on and look and see just how pathetic and poor their life situation really was. We also know from these primary sources that if you manage to go out to the rural areas, we talked about how a third of them had done that they actually had plenty of space, plenty of light, plenty of money. If you think about rural areas, that spread out, especially people who came from countries where they were already farming. They already knew how to farm in their homeland. They came over here and they took advantage of things like the Homestead Act and cheap land out in the West at this time, and they went ahead and settled there. We are finding that they didn't have these health issues that the urban poor had in the cities, but of course they had that skill in order to make farming work. So that was what helped them. So ignore this for a second while we slip to the next slide.
The Gym A circle.
Look at the picture
to the Gym A
here on this next slide.
That bus. Thank you.
Okay, look at the picture here. We see an example of some of these children in these tenement houses. We see these poor children. We see what life was really like for them. So you can pause and look that a little longer if you'd like. But I've got a couple more pictures I want to show you about this. But first, let's talk about what are called settlement houses. Settlement houses like Jane Addams. Jane Addams was very famous for her settlement house called Hull House. And what houses like the Hull House and other settlement houses in other areas did is it provided these working urban poor population with better living conditions. And we're talking, they might provide medical care, they might provide recreation, classes that they could learn a skill and get better jobs. They even provided them something as simple as a hot lunch that they could go and eat, because otherwise they wouldn't have money to feed themselves or feed their family. So these settlement houses provided those resources. They were ran by middle class women who lived in the houses and provided these resources to the working urban poor who would not have the resources otherwise. And Jane Addams, like I said, is sort of the most famous example of that. But we see there were several settlement houses in different urban areas during this time. Part of what was going on is what's called the social gospel movement. And the social gospel movement is basically applying Christianity and the idea of Christian charity and helping, loving one another, treat others, as you would be treated, the golden rule. The second biggest commandment is love others as I have loved you. So they're taking these ideas of Christianity and they're specifically applying them to helping the urban poor. And it's not just, it's the right thing to do, but it's the Christian thing to do. And that's what we call the social gospel, is the gospel taking this Christian message and applying it to social issues of people's welfare and taking care of people. So socially helping out other people. We see some pictures here. I mentioned I wanted to show you some pictures. So if you look in your notes, you're following along, you see in the whole house, we see there's lots of beds here for children to sleep in. It was we're not talking about like a single person, just their house, but hold on. Okay. Oh, the joys. Okay, but so we're not talking about just a single house here, but we're talking about a big house where these middle class women would stay and provide these people with these resources. And you can just see how much better the children were. I mean, even though they're poor and they still don't have a lot of resources, they have enough because of the settlement houses like Hull House. Okay. All right, I mentioned at the beginning, one of the very first things that we talked about in this video was the idea of immigrants coming here and immediately staying in the urban cities because that's where the factories were. If you were an unskilled immigrant who didn't speak the language, you're not going to be able to start your own business. You're not going to be able to work at some of these skilled labor jobs. And so the factories were basically your only source of a job. They provided lots of those low-paying, unskilled jobs. 80% of the unskilled work that needed to get done, those people that were anybody can just kind of come off the street and do it, 80% of those people were immigrants. And of course, we talked the last video about how that union workers didn't like this, about how they would often immigrants would end up being those strikebreakers or those scabs, because they were willing to do the work. They needed the money. You see, when I talk about needing the money, you can see some of the figures there. A family needed $16 per week to survive. Okay, it doesn't seem like a lot, but of course, because of inflation, that was a significant amount, especially when you considered that when you worked in a textile factory, you only got $4 a week. Okay, and when you worked in a garment factory, you got $1.25 a week. So certainly not going to equal up to the $16 that you need, and that's why you're going to see a lot of the women and the children also working. We know women worked in factories. We know children worked in factories because they had to get to $16 somehow. If you look again at those figures, sort of modern day numbers, $423 a week only adds up to $22,000 a year. That's well below even modern standard of poverty. And that's what your sort of regular immigrant coming over here without any skills, that's what life was like for them. So when we're talking about the urban poor, this is why. Just kind of a couple more slides here talking about what this work was like for these working poor immigrants. Is this sort of cartoon here called galley labor, sort of working in the galleys here, and we see children. And if you look at the images, you kind of see in that even just the bottom left corner, you see those children, and how, they're just like bent over backwards. And who's the boss? Who's running them that way? Well, greed is running them that way. And the idea here is, kind of referring back to the big businesses we talked about, last week or the last section of the unit, when we talked about industrialization and big business. We see a lot of even our most famous captains of industry were so greedy with their money that they were willing to pay these immigrants, $1.25 a week when they knew that they needed $16. No one was ignorant of what life was like in the tenements. As ignorant as you wanted to be, it was pretty obvious that this was no way for people to live, and yet this is what big business was doing. The idea of a sweatshop, that's a pretty straightforward term, sweatshop. You're working in a shop, you're working in these factories, these small cramped working conditions, low wages, long hours. There's no air conditioning, there's not even really fans going to cool you off. You're sweating, you're doing manual labor, hard work. You're going to be sweating, you're going to be hot. This is the idea of a sweatshop that is coming out of this period. So when we're talking about work for the immigrants and these working urban poor, this is the kind of work that we're talking about here. It's a sort of galley labor, working in things like sweatshops. We talked already about how crime, disease, pollution, these are all common things. We talk about pollution, pollution, this idea that we shouldn't pollute and, we should have all these regulations. That's a new sort of just within a couple generations kind of concept. In the 1900s, you can smoke, put smoke through the air, no one would even think anything of it. And so pollution was very common. People were often getting very sick because of what was going in their lungs. And we talked about disease. We're going to talk about crime a little bit in the next video. So you kind of get an idea of what life was like for them. We have not talked much about the middle class. So if you'll indulge me for just a couple minutes here, I'll give you a little bit of information about the middle class. These are going to be your doctors, your lawyers, your architects, your engineers, okay, not your, captains of industry, robber barons, these multi-millionaires, but certainly doing better than the poor. They're actually going to earn twice as much money as the poor, easily, doing these sort of consistent work. These are going to be your doctors, your lawyers, engineers, those kinds of things I mentioned. And what's so interesting about the middle class is they're going to be the ones that actually end up utilizing public transportation the most, and they're going to expand. Instead of living right in the heart of the city, they're going to sort of live on the outskirts of the city and use public transportation to get into the city to work. And so,
Attention students, this is your 5-minute reminder. The activity buses will be pulling away from the Gym 8 circle at 6:15 in 5 minutes. Please make your way to the Gym A Circle so you can be aboard those buses. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.
Even with the video, I can't seem to escape these sort of school day announcements, so just indulge me for a minute. And so the middle class would, of course, expand the cities, and we see in the notes here that they were the ones promoting the use of things like department stores, household conveniences, buying those things out of catalogs, those kinds of things that we talked about last section of our notes. The middle class is going to be the one sort of driving that and doing that, certainly not the working poor. But that's all I have for you for this video. Hopefully, one way or another, you're getting the information you need. You're able to watch these videos and take these notes. And if you have any questions, that's what the library time is for. As you're taking notes and you're just like, I have no idea what she meant by that, certainly stop me and ask me. Make sure that you understand this information, because the test will be on Tuesday the 23rd or Wednesday the 24th, depending if you're B day or C day. And that I will be looking for your notes as well. So make sure that you are, writing things down as we go throughout these videos. If you have any questions, just feel free to ask. Otherwise, that's it for this video. Until next time, I'll talk to you later.